Chapter 4. The Hunt. As said, the chief exercise is Gurdjieff's buried dog. In order to find that dog, we must first find several of Gurdjieff's other hidden teachings, some of which may initially seem unrelated to our goal. But taken together, those discoveries will lead to his dog. In our search, we will look in Gurdjieff's tall towers, in his long entangled sentences, and under the mountain of words he so often throws at us. Upon finding such places, we will look there very closely. What we may find in this or that place does not matter, because we hunt anything and everything Gurdjieff conceals. That, places of concealment, is the clue to our game, and that is our initial target. We need to learn everything possible of how Gurdjieff accomplishes his sleight of hand and conceals the clues to his secrets, including and especially his buried dog. Learning those techniques will be difficult, so difficult that we will be tempted to appeal to others for help. But Gurdjieff has made his buried dog and everything else of his third series invisible to the many, so that those who rely on the opinion of others will get only a weak, homogenized version of his teaching. Regardless of how intelligent and how well read others may be, or how many learned opinions they share, they cannot and will not pierce the veil of Scheherazade. Even those who are left brain brilliant will find nothing but scraps, because due to the nature of true knowledge, the intellect is not enough. The intellect is considerably less than one half of what is required. Those who rely on intuition will find more, but even that is not enough. In an apparent conundrum, in spite of the fact that we cannot rely on others, no one on his own is capable of unearthing that dog. What it all comes down to is that sometimes the teacher is just too high for us in our initial state. As we cover in a later chapter, Gurdjieff says we must have an intermediary, one he calls an elder, who is closer to our own level. But we must be careful in choosing our elders, and that is where intuition serves best. Patriarch Knott says one of the first things a teacher must do is train and prepare a few assistants. Gurdjieff confirms this in Life is Real, page 28. On this occasion I will say only that, after some years, I found it necessary to originate somewhere an institution for the preparation of helper instructors, in order to be able to put into the lives of people what I had already learned. Gurdjieff prepared several helper instructors. They are our elders and they will be our guides. We will recognize Gurdjieff's true assistants from all of the others, not by mind with its never-ending analyses, arguments and counter-arguments, but only by intuition. You will better understand both the why and the how of that when we cover some of the abilities of Keshjan body, particularly the way in which Keshjan speaks. In my opinion, Charles Stanley Knott and Frank Pinder are among those Gurdjieff prepared as helpers. If we can intuitively recognize them as such, they will be willingly our guides. Patriarch Knott was well acquainted with Gurdjieff's buried dog, but he knew better than to just tell us about it, which would have been useless or worse. Instead, he talks about how to track it, what signs it leaves, and how to follow a trail so that we can find it for ourselves. In his tales, he takes us on a tour of his old hunting grounds while sharing some of his hard-earned experience. Now he too has disappeared, leaving the field to us. But he left the hunting stories of his long search and incredible efforts and clues as to where and for what to look. He sometimes puts such clues in the form of musings, where he seems to be talking to himself, but he put those musings into his books, and we will have a look at several before we're done. His following remark is, how to say, it looks tame. At first glance it seems there is not much to it, just things we think we already know. But if you will ponder the matter, you will see that he has pulled together items that we have seen only separately, but looking at them together gives our perception depth and makes it easier to see their interaction. Two things seen individually are often nothing more than a couple of dry facts, but together they combine to produce a third something, perhaps an idea we've not yet considered. So many of Knott's ideas are presented in that way that it is clear he had a working knowledge of the law of three. This first musing comes from Journey, page 101. In the book one is constantly reminded of the idea that if a man, by conscious effort or by accident, has acquired the conception of a soul, he must, willy-nilly, become coated again and again with a planetary body until the soul becomes perfected, or it will suffer and languish eternally. This teaching is to help these unfortunates, people like us. This work is for those who have in themselves the conception or beginning of a soul, of the immortal spark, and it provides a practical method. One of the problems with finding such remarks in a book is that they are immediately followed by more words, sentences, paragraphs, and we can hardly resist reading on, stuffing more words into our mind, which keeps us from digesting what we've just read. So let's pause and go over Patriarch Knott's remarks with a fine-toothed comb. These unfortunates. Now I know that almost everyone reading this already knows what Knott is talking about with the conception of a soul. His use of the phrase, will suffer and languish eternally, is a dead giveaway that he is talking about Keshjan body. But Keshjan is just another name with which we have become too familiar, as with self-remembering. If you will, just bear with me and pretend for a moment that you do not know what he means. For the real meaning of Knott's message, we will initially look at two of Gurdjieff's remarks. First, one from Beelzebub's Tales. Blessed is he that hath a soul, blessed also is he that hath none, but grief and sorrow are to him that hath in himself the conception. Then another version from the walls of the study house. Blessed is he who has a soul, blessed is he who has none, but woe and grief to him who has it in embryo. By mixing those two, we see the conception of a soul is its embryo. As a human embryo is not yet a man, but only the fragile beginnings of a man, likewise with any embryo, it is nowhere near what it may possibly, eventually become, but it is only its precarious beginning. So it is of the embryo of soul, but with one major difference. He says that one with this embryo of soul must, willy-nilly, become coated again and again with a planetary body. What does willy-nilly mean? That is an old term, not quite ancient, but considerably aged and long fallen from grace. In past usage, it meant something like inevitably, regardless, required, and so forth. When the patriarch says one with embryo of soul must willy-nilly be coated again and again with a planetary body, he means the poor embryo has no choice in the matter. At that point, all of its wishes, all of your wishes, hopes and aspirations mean absolutely nothing. You should remember the term willy-nilly because in a closely related passage found in one of his lesser-known books, a virtual book of his third series by the title of Dreams and Fantasies of People in the 20th Century, it is used as a connector with Knott's above mention of recurrence, by which Gurdjieff tells us his true meaning. Continuing with Knott's remarks, when he says the embryo must be coated, that is not like a spray-on coat of paint, but the embryo puts on something like an overcoat or a suit, and hopefully the suit the embryo puts on turns out to be a human body. So the embryo puts on this brand new bodysuit and wears it around for however long it lasts. Then, when that one dies, the embryo puts on another bodysuit, wears that out until it wears out, then puts on another and another, forever, or perhaps only almost forever. Not much difference to me. Now, Patriarch Knott doesn't say this, but Gurdjieff does. These embryos of soul are rare things. Not everybody has one. In fact, very few do. Most of the bodies we see driving around, going to the store, making babies and war and such, are just empty vessels without soul. They don't even have its embryo. and that is not such a bad position to be in, because when they die, they, such as they are, simply cease to exist. That's it, end of suffering. But for one with embryo of soul, the suffering continues. They, that is their Kesjans, with a reduced load of merd, which we will cover later, put on brand new body suits and start all over again in the process of serial recurrence. Worse, and disturbing to consider, perhaps the suffering of these unfortunates increases with each new recurrence. Now we get to the really interesting part where he says, this teaching is to help these unfortunates, people like us. What could he mean by people like us? In that passage he does not say of or to whom he is speaking, likely us, but we do know who is speaking, and if we've studied his books we know something of the struggles he went through, the work and super efforts, the long years of despair over little or slow progress, war, loneliness, scraping for a living, several emotional and spiritual crises. Perhaps that also describes you. But in spite of everything he endured, he never quit working on himself. Even after Gurdjieff's death, he did not cease working and making real progress. And we know that because we see it in his writings. Charles Stanley not changed, and his writings show it. Teachings of Gurdjieff opened my eyes. It freed me to go outside of the lines and then some. That book is an essential part of what Dr. Sturgeonable calls Gurdjieff's very big plan. It carries instructions given to Araj by correspondence with Gurdjieff, some of which we will cover soon, without which, as I've said, no one would have been able to solve Gurdjieff's biggest puzzle, the buried dog. On the other hand, in the 8 years, probably 7, between the publishing of Teachings and Journey, not matured greatly, and not just in the usual sense, but in spirit. It took me a good long while to see that, but you know how it goes. The more I learned, the smarter and wiser he became. I am embarrassed to say that when I first encountered his books, which was around 2003, I really underestimated his second book. At that time I thought the book Teachings was great, which it is, but I thought that just Teachings was great. His second book, Journey, seemed to be about everyday life and a little on the dry side. But I was wrong. In Journey, the patriarch shows he has developed an Asian mind of his own. Never tell the truth, says Gurdjieff, then whispers, at least not directly. Patriarch Not mastered the light touch of that indirect method and shows it by clothing some of Gurdjieff's lessons in garments of daily life, one in a story about a seemingly physical problem to which we should all aspire. In chapter 27 of Journey, you will find his description of the disorder he suffered, similar to Beelzebub's remarks, page 1213, where he describes most of our conversations as being nothing more than a symphony of words without content, and to the ear of this impartial observer it is all perceived only as what is called in the ancient Sino-Paulo-Pianian tales of the 1001 Nights, cacophonous, fantastic nonsense. If you read a little beyond that excerpt, on the next page, you will find Gurdjieff's mention of the isolation that our cacophonous conversations impose on men, similar to Nott's situation. That is what Patriarch Nott was reduced to hearing, and you may, with sufficient progress, look forward to much the same for yourself. Warning given but not understood. A very interesting and informative something related to Kesjan body has to do with an event that occurred during Nott's visit with a friend of the family, a part gypsy who did card readings and such. During that visit, while reading the cards for Nott, she was brought up with a start and said, "But he'll get over it, he'll get over it." Her reaction had little to do with reading cards, except perhaps the card reading made her a little more receptive to impulses from the higher powers. When Nott asked what she meant, she said only, "It's one of your sons, but don't worry, he'll get over it." Nott didn't take it seriously, and so didn't press for details, which son, when, and such, and after a few days he forgot all about it. About a month later he says, "A strange feeling came to me that something unusual was going to happen." But he did not make the connection between that feeling and the outburst of his gypsy friend. As a result of his inability to connect the dots, due primarily to the self-chatter by which he tried to explain that feeling to himself, which self-chatter he pointedly describes, he did nothing, changed nothing, and so allowed the predicted event to occur as if predetermined. The catastrophe happened next day, an accident in which our younger son, aged 6, just escaped with his life and was permanently crippled. That accident, by the way, was not entirely predetermined, but, to the beings of the fourth way, it was entirely and precisely predictable. There is nothing unusual in Knott's having missed that message. He was young and still inexperienced with epiograms and such. We are all like that initially. It is difficult to tell the difference between such subtle things and our daydreaming, which is a very good reason to learn to still the mind and imagination. It may have taken a little time for all of that to sink in, but not learned. When later Gurdjieff was told of those events by Jane Heap, he understood, and it was not of the accident but of the learning and Knott's new-found ability to receive and recognise such messages that Gurdjieff said, "is good, is good." Although Knott may have missed that message initially, he learned from it and included the experience in his second book for our benefit. Perhaps from his example we can learn to hear better and sooner. Learning to hear such messages is important. But to hear such subtleties, the mind, which usually runs on like a spaghetti western or a Bronte novel, must not be too busy. Self-awareness will help in that. Knott's account of those events begins on page 117 of Journey. You'll find a similar account of a fortune-teller predicting certain events about Gurdjieff, including a shooting accident, in Meetings, page 62-4. Such strange phenomena do occur. I call them phenomena only in a limited sense, because for beings of the fourth way there is nothing phenomenal about it. For those with completed Keshjan and some development of higher bodies, such things are as simple as picking up a phone and making a call, and they do so frequently. It is only on the receiving end of the communication, on our end, that problems arise. Now let's get back to Gurdjieff's target audience, these unfortunates. By that remark, Knott means people, sort of, like himself, who through great struggles, whether in this life or previously, whether consciously or accidentally, already have Keshjan body. It is for the unfortunates that Gurdjieff's teaching exists, and for whom Knott's books and this book are written. But to develop this idea further, we will have to leave the patriarch and take this up with the master himself. In order to make our transition from Knott to Gurdjieff a little smoother, recall my earlier remark that this book is written for and will be most useful to those who have read and studied all 4 of Gurdjieff's books, the Patriarch's 2 books, and Ouspensky's and Hartmann's 1 each in the recommended way. That is a hefty load of study and requires a great deal of effort. Can you imagine Ouspensky doing that? He collected and burned his group's copies of Herald, seeing it as proof Gurdjieff had gone over the hill. He couldn't read Beelzebub's Tales either, saying, "It sticks in my throat." Actually, it simply challenged him with material he could not immediately fathom. His vanity could not tolerate that and survive, so rather than admit his limitations and patiently work to understand, he took the easy way, he blamed the book, and he is not alone. Many students of Gurdjieff's ideas have not read all of his books as advised. Obviously, socially supported group readings do not count. True, Gurdjieff held group readings himself, but he did so for purposes that do not and cannot apply to group readings today. And Gurdjieff was Gurdjieff. His place cannot be assumed by some group discussion leader. Besides, any and all advantage offered by reading or hearing Beelzebub read aloud will be had, and in much stronger form, by simply following Gurdjieff's friendly advice. The study required of us is extremely difficult, and those who have completed our reading list in good form have done so against all odds. One would think it has taken a lot of willpower and discipline, but that thinking would be only partially right. The serious study of all of those books repeatedly was not done by willpower. It created willpower. The long hard struggle to read and understand Gurdjieff's books has resulted in development of greater will and discipline, and those who have studied all of those books have done so because they had no choice. They were compelled to study them. Compelled, some will say. What an absurd idea. Compelled by whom or what? That is a fair question, but from my experience and from what I've learned from Patriarch Knott and Frank Pinder, I think my theory holds water, and I'll explain my reasoning in a moment. First, let's slip quietly into the back of a room where Gurdjieff is giving a talk that has a bearing both on these unfortunates and on my theory that those who seriously study Gurdjieff's writings do so because they have no choice. You will find the following talk in fragments, page 32 to 3, where Gurdjieff is talking about the good brigand. Crystallization is possible on any foundation. Take, for example, a brigand, a really good, genuine brigand. I knew such brigands in the Caucasus. He will stand with a rifle behind a stone by the roadside for 8 hours without stirring. Could you do this? All the time, mind you, a struggle is going on in him. He is thirsty and hot, and flies are biting him, but he stands still. Another is a monk. He's afraid of the devil. All night long he beats his head on the floor and prays. Thus crystallization is achieved. In such ways, people can generate in themselves an enormous inner strength. They can endure torture. They can get what they want. This means that there is now in them something solid, something permanent. Such people can become immortal, but what is the good of it? A man of this kind becomes an immortal thing, although a certain amount of consciousness is sometimes preserved in him. But even this, it must be remembered, occurs very rarely. Now, if a brigand, based upon the hardships and discipline of his criminal profession, can have Kesjan, and if a monk, due to the privations and discipline coming from nothing more than his superstitious fear of the devil, could develop Kesjan, then you too can have Kesjan body, and possibly do. But don't let that go to your head, because if you are one of these unfortunates, your Kesjan is most assuredly in basic or near basic form. And as Gurdjieff says, what is the good of that? What is the good of Kesjan body? When speaking of Kesjan body, we must use our knowledge of the law of octaves. As there are 7 scale steps in any octave, there will be 7 levels of development or strength of Kesjan body. And for each scale step there are internal octaves that must be traversed, which we will cover in some detail in a later chapter. Basic Kesjan is the Do, the first scale step in Kesjan's octave, which means only that Kesjan exists, but without benefit of any further development. At that level, as Gurdjieff says of the good brigand's Kesjan, it is all but useless. The second scale, Re, indicates a much stronger Kesjan, 7 times stronger, one that knows and sees enough to be seriously interested in Gurdjieff's teachings. The third scale step, Mi, which is the highest level of development possible in the natural world, that is, without some kind of outside help or force, will compel one to seek the truth. When such a one finds Gurdjieff's teachings, he will take to it immediately, and although he may take a break now and then, he will never leave. Having Kesjan body at any of the first 3 scale steps of development also gives one a bit of insight into this run by the inmates insane asylum in which we live. However, since the reason of such a Kesjan is undeveloped, its understanding is only partial, leaving the unfortunate with some insights but no real answers or solutions. Thus those with such Kesjans are and will continue to be blessed with grief, suffering and sorrow. Having Kejjan also means that you have lived many times before, starting who knows when in the distant past, going round and round ever since. Of course you recall little to nothing of those lives. Such memories, although in some cases quite real, seldom survive early childhood. Unless you are willing to work and find a way out, you will continue to recur indefinitely, because Kejjan also gives a near endless supply of round-trip tickets from here to there and back, starting almost from scratch with each new recurrence. That, by the by, is recurrence as opposed to reincarnation, which is possible only for conscious beings. Or you can look at it as involuntary reincarnation with the added benefit, a truly mixed blessing, of a memory wipe, leaving no conscious memory of lessons learned. That false recurrence of a slightly conscious embryo of soul, leading to one more time in an almost endless stream of semi-conscious lifetimes of suffering, is not what I would call a future to die for. In my opinion, we need to find a way out of this morass and move on. I hear rumours of better places in the cosmos. Perhaps if we work and prepare for it, we can look forward to moving up to a better neighbourhood. While it is true that the magnetic centre may be enough to attract a man to the fourth way, it is not enough to bind him to it. Many are attracted to Gurdjieff's teachings, but few remain for the duration. Some who even studied in person with Gurdjieff drifted away. If you are one of these unfortunates who acquired the embryo of soul and then continue your search for the truth through subsequent years and decades, then you have probably raised your Kejjan from Do to the level of Ray, or possibly even to me in the octave of Kejjan's development, in which case it was not your magnetic centre, but your stronger Kejjan that saw something of worth in Gurdjieff's teachings, and it is your Kejjan that through the years and even now, whether you like it or not, binds you to his teachings above all others. That is a good sign of whether you are among these unfortunates. You cannot leave Gurdjieff's teachings, though you may have tried. You may have thrown his books into a trash heap somewhere, as some have actually done, but if so, you just had to turn around and buy them again. You were compelled to do so. You had no choice, and that is good. Gurdjieff teaches, and by experience we confirm that man cannot choose, he cannot do. It is absurd to think that any such so-called man could or would voluntarily choose to endure the demands of the real fourth way. That is why I say, these unfortunates, people like us, have no choice. You stumbled across Gurdjieff, and your Kejjan spirit recognized some of the truths in his writings as coming from a real teacher, and you were from that moment on, with perhaps a short break here and there, hooked. But then, in all probability, at some point in your study, as most have done, myself included, you took over and decided to follow the Salzmanites, the Ospenskianites, or any of the other ites who were only too happy to tell you what to think, what to believe, and how to attain the privilege of belonging to some higher echelon of their elite group. You may have tried that several times, but those authorities always came up short, and they always will. No matter how sincere they seemed, or how sincerely you tried to follow their instruction, there has been no significant change. But their instruction is not needed, because Gurdjieff gives all the instructions we can handle, and more. However, he seldom gives direct instruction. Even at the Prairie, his teaching was indirect and took the form of metaphor or odd remarks said to one but meant for another. In his books, Gurdjieff's instructions is likewise concealed, disguised, or in low profile, and most of it is carried by demonstration, although now and then he will put it to us as a piece of advice lightly veiled by something. Only those who work hard and remain alert will become able to see his real meaning. Even then, a bit of help from above may be needed, contrary to what many think, and although we may not at first notice, such help is not as rare among these unfortunates as it may seem, at least not among those willing to work. Again from Teachings, in a summary of talks by Frank Pinder on page 226. When the wagoner appealed to Jupiter to get his wagon out of the mud, Jupiter said, "First put your own shoulder to the wheel." Men cannot see that it is necessary first of all to do something about themselves. For thousands of years they have been trying to reform each other. If a man was set about working on himself instead of praying to his far-off God to save the people, he would find that the kingdom of heaven is not indifferent to those who try. However, like not, we will have to learn to recognize help from above. But the emphasis in the above excerpt is not on heaven, or on help from above, but on work. For instance, work on your inner ability with something more important than even air. Are you following Gurdjieff's friendly advice as you read? But there is something else in Pinder's last sentence worth a little pondering. Since we know that heaven is a fantasy, he is obviously using heaven as euphemism for the next level in the cosmoses, accurately described by Moses as the land of hills and valleys, but sugar-coated by the scribes as the land of milk and honey. We might call it the land of the fourth way. If the beings of that next level are not indifferent to our efforts, then they must be aware of our efforts. But how could they know? That brings to mind the many times Beelzebub mentions observing, from Mars, the free-brained beings of Earth through his Tescu Anu in such detail that he may as well have been viewing from the house next door. That, if you think about it, is a strangely comforting thought. It is made a little less so only by knowing that beings of that level were once free-brained beings themselves, and they know first-hand all of our imperfections and difficulties. And we know from Gurdjieff's example they are patient teachers. Unlike the Osbeskianites, the Salzmanites, and any of the other ites with whom you may have studied, mingled, Gurdjieff and the elders do not tell you what to think, neither do they serve roast pigeon on a platter. For a variety of reasons you must find what you seek for yourself. You must work for it. Otherwise, what you learn, memorize, is just someone's opinion. Whether mine, Knott's, or even Gurdjieff's. Opinion it is, and you already have more than enough of those. Any new opinion just gets mixed in with the rest, and the new is lost among the old. But when you study long and hard, when you work for it, any conclusion reached is based on a more solid foundation and becomes part of your personal conviction. A strong personal conviction is what it will take to persist in the work of completing Kesdjan body. Again, looking back on your past efforts, while your Kesdjan may have recognized something of rare worth in Gurdjieff's writings, which you probably felt intuitively, it was you, in quotation marks, who then took over and selected them, the ites, their meetings, books, and advice. The problem is that with you, me, and they, most of the time our centre of gravity is in that part of us called personality. Gurdjieff says, and it is literally true, that personality is usually the more active, the dominant part of us. Its mentation, based on the rather shallow but always busy serial associative processes, is the third, the lowest and slowest kind of reason. Beelzebub's Tales, page 770. In that third kind of reason, some may operate faster and some slower. All the same, it is mechanical. Such mechanized thinking leads only to overlapping associative cycles, and while those cycles may occasionally move in some definite direction, that direction is not maintained for long. For details on that, see fragments page 127 to 130, and a few pages before and after. In that section, Gurdjieff not only explains the lack of real productivity of our past efforts, he even predicts the future for most of us. Personality's third kind of reason, with its persistent dominance, presents an almost insurmountable problem, a real flesh and blood puzzle in which you must find a way to overcome you, or your tendency to dominate the more real you, which is a self, correction of self, and nigh impossible to to accomplish. In my opinion, and in keeping with Gurdjieff's advice, the only way of overcoming the limitation of the third kind of reason is to replace it with something better, and that begins with sensing the whole of yourself and reading as advised by Gurdjieff. There is another side to you, your essence, your more real self, but due to our abnormal society and lopsided education, be sure to remember this for later, essence is untrained and inexperienced in reason, the Taos, page 568, and therefore lacks good judgment. Also, essence is usually angry and resentful on account of many real and imagined slights. Essence, with its emotional centre of gravity, is more emotional and less stable than personality, which tells you that even though essence is your more real self, you cannot count on essence to lead you rightly either. Neither personality nor essence will do. The way I see it, you are in a deep pickle jar with a lid on it. So what can you do about it? Not much, at least not on your own. You've already tried following your own best judgment, which led you to this or that authority, but with no good result. You've also tried going it alone, again without much progress. Still, that was better than following some so-called authority's instructions, so congratulations on that. But going it alone will not do because, through no fault of your own, you are limited by the least, the third kind of reason, and that will never be enough. You need guidance from one of higher reason, from one you can trust, from Gurdjieff. Second kind of reason. I can almost hear the wheels turning in the heads of some of my readers as they think, but what about Kesjan? They may think, if I have Kesjan, and Kesjan has the second kind of reason, then I'll just toss everyone else aside and let Kesjan be my guide. That finally is the right answer, almost, just not quite yet, because while we do need the second kind of reason, which is possible only with Kesjan, that level of reason is not Kesjan's birthright, but is the property only of a completed Kesjan. From Beelzebub's Tales, page 770. The second being reason, which is named Okia Ta'i Tokasa, can be in the presences of those free-brain beings in whom their second being body Kesjan is already completely coated and functions independently. Nascent Kesjan, the kind that recurs, is formed but undeveloped. It is mere embryo. As with the good brigand, Kesjan has not reached its fullness and acquired the requisite gradation of reason, which is why we recur, and will continue to do so until Kesjan is completely coated and begins functioning independently. Then Kesjan will consciously, intentionally, and functioning independently begin to absorb and assimilate such cosmic substances as required for the formation of the third body, page 764, at which time you can shove everyone else aside, all but Gurdjieff. That is because you will still need instruction from him on certain additional conscious and intentional efforts. Just as his instruction will help accelerate Kesjan's growth, it will also help accelerate development of highest body. When Kesjan is stronger and beginning to function independently, you will be able to hear its sixth sense voice more clearly and better follow Kesjan's lead. Until then, your efforts must be to bring Kesjan to completion. Prior to that, Kesjan is too weak to lead anyone. Some headstrong types have insisted on following Kesjan's lead prematurely, but an undeveloped Kesjan is easily overpowered by our more predominant personality, who immediately takes over and by nothing more than associative thinking begins to dictate what, in his opinion, is intuitive and what is not, as if he knew. But of course he doesn't know any better. How could he? Essence will only contribute his 2 cents with a nudge here and there, as he recognises some of all the religious hokey-pokey learned in your youth. And what will you make of that? Then, and worse, remnants of the lovely Kunda buffer will politely join the party, gently turn you and all your parts on your heads, gracefully mislead the whole lot of you, and in circles you will go as before, none the wiser. But there is a way out of our terrible situation if you will listen to Gurdjieff. He speaks of that with his promise, and then delivers on that promise with instruction in his third series on the 3 books of man and the identity of an ancient ritual he discovered. That ritualized exercise will help greatly in further developing Keshjan. But as with everything else he gives, you must work for it. In my opinion, you have no good alternative but to make Keshjan stronger than both personality and essence. But how is that to be accomplished? Well, for one thing, and something you've already been doing for years, more study, but study unencumbered by ego. From Beelzebub's Tales, bottom of 822. Study, not for the satisfaction of your, what are called vainglorious, proud and self-loving weaknesses, but for the attainment of a higher gradation of being. Another thing, simple in concept but difficult to achieve safely and effectively, we must learn to feed Keshjan. Like any other living thing, in order to grow, Keshjan needs food. Like other bodies, Keshjan will have to be fed daily, with regularity, and you are the one who will prepare and serve his meals. The food of Keshjan is in the air we breathe, but all the breathing we do in the course of our normal activities does not count. The physical body, knowing nothing of the needs of Keshjan, only demands enough air for its own needs, leaving no surplus for higher bodies. For that surplus we will need the special meal of the ritual exercise as taken by Beelzebub in the monasterial refectory, page 1180 of the Karnak. In that regard it is good to recall the aphorism that every man who thinks for himself lives in a sort of monastery. This exercise, which Gurdjieff mentions only briefly as the chief exercise, is mimed in a certain chapter of Beelzebub's Tales. It is the method for taking that special meal, and your first goal will be to find his instructions on that ritual exercise. The odd thing about that is that we, each one of us, have already found his instructions. That is, we have to run across them, we have read them. We simply did not know it. Apparently, something in you knew. Keshjan recognized some of Gurdjieff's writings as true instruction. Personality and essence may also have seen a wee bit, but they saw things in their own way, partially, and that is not enough. You must see and understand Gurdjieff's instructions with all 3 of your major components. That term, major components, is simply my way of saying what Gurdjieff calls the 3 totalities of functioning. To understand what is meant by that, it is useful to recall that a major component is usually made up of 1 or more sub-assemblies of smaller component parts, as applied by Gurdjieff's use of the word totalities. 3 totalities of functioning. Gurdjieff covers the 3 totalities on pages 144 to 149 of Life is Real, while relating the contents of an ancient manuscript which he says is written in allegory. The text of this manuscript is expounded as what was done in antiquity, podio in the form of symbolizing, or, as it is called in esoteric science, making alike, that is, allegorically. Thus we know that his description of the 3 totalities is part of his second series, which consists of metaphor and allegory. It is important to remember as you read his account of the ancient manuscript that it is ancient, and therefore applies more to men of ancient times and less to contemporary man, except of course for these unfortunates. Gurdjieff begins reading from the manuscript. The general psyche of every man on reaching maturity, which begins on an average in the male sex at 20 years and in the female sex at the beginning of the 13th year, consists of 3 totalities of functioning which have almost nothing in common with each other. We've heard the phrase almost nothing in common with each other before, but whereas in Gurdjieff's earlier talks that description is applied to two somethings, now in a more advanced second series teaching, it is three somethings that have almost nothing in common. The factors producing in man the first totality of functioning, unless special measures are employed, are formed, as has been established long ago, only in childhood, in boys on an average until the age of 11 years, and in girls until the age of 7. In the average child, then, the first totality may mature until about age 11, or, as he says elsewhere, in some cases it stops at an even younger age to become a small, shrunken thing. Continuing. The factors producing the second totality of functioning begin to form in boys from the age of 9 years, and in girls even from the age of 4 years, lasting in different cases a different length of time, approximately until the attainment of maturity. Unfortunately, in Western societies, the time frame for the formation of the first two totalities has changed. With the continuing westernization of the world and the progressive lowering of the age when we begin our famous education, the second totality begins formation sooner, and maturation of the first totality is thus cut short, ending in Western societies these days often well before age 11. That does not apply to these unfortunates, but only to the general population. That may not bode well for future generations, but perhaps great nature or other forces will make adjustments. Continuing. And factors producing the third totality begin to form from the attainment of maturity, continuing in the average man at present only until the age of 60, and women only to the age of 45. You may have noticed that the first two totalities are formed before the formation of the third totality begins. That is because the forming of all the factors for the function of these three entirely separate totalities of functioning proceeds in people in accordance also with the universal law of threefoldness. In the law of three, two things merge to produce a third. Thus, by the merging of the first two totalities of functioning, the third totality is formed and strengthened. The factors of the third totality of functionings are formed from the results of contemplation, that is, from results received from the voluntary contact of the factors of the first two totalities, for which, moreover, the results of the second totality serve as the anode beginning, and the results of the first totality serve as the cathode. So one of the first two totalities is the active positive, the other the passive negative, which is another clue to their identity. The periods of development of the three totalities are limited, but that applies only to the average man. They can develop for a much longer period of time. But in the case of people who have consciously perfected themselves to the so-called all centres awake state, that is, to the state of being able in their waking state to think and feel on their own initiative, these factors still continue to form in man until the age of 300 years and in woman until the age of 200. That may sound utterly fantastic, but not if you consider that, in some, Kejjan has been formed. Kejjan body, spirit, is able to persist much longer than the physical body. Gurdjieff continues reading. One of the properties of such an actualization of all three separate totalities of functionings producing the general psyche of man is that which, by combinations of the voluntary contact of the actions of these three independent totalities of functioning, causes to proceed in one of them the imprintation of those processes proceeding in the other totalities, as well as those proceeding outside of the given man, which happen to fall into the sphere of the subjective action of his organs of perception. As I said, this is where things get interesting and a bit complicated, because whereas before we had only two somethings vying for control, now we have three. As to how they interact, aside from the above described sharing of information, Gurdjieff says, that totality always becomes the initiating factor for the realization of a common function of the three separate totalities, which represent the general psyche of man, in which at the given moment this gradation of the total state has its centre of gravity. We will return to the interesting state of affairs that may occasionally arise due to our centre of gravity shifting between the three totalities in a later chapter. It is fairly difficult to sort out just what those three totalities are in real and usable form. At least it was for me. When I first read that section, I tried to understand the three totalities from what I knew of our three centres, but that was never entirely satisfactory. However, over time and with continued effort, I've learned otherwise. One thing that helped me understand better was to use substitution. By substituting the words active and passive for two related terms used by Gurdjieff in that section, things began to make better sense. Additionally, there are certain words and phrases he uses in that section that he has used previously in talks where the context made clear his meaning, such as nothing in common with each other and intentionally implanted. Also, the age of the first totality tells us a little something of its usual name, as confirmed by a passage found on page 161 of Fragments. It may be useful to think of the first and second totalities as relating to their half of the three centres, as the left and right hands relate to their fingers, their component parts. The third totality will have a similar relation, not to the centres, but to the first two totalities, which are its component parts. Unlike the first two, the third totality is not directly related to or composed of centres, but is the result of the coming into contact and sharing that which is the same in the first two totalities. Three totalities but four personalities. We know Gurdjieff's remarks on the three totalities of functioning belong to the second series, because he as much as tells us so by saying the text is expounded allegorically or by making alike. But with his remarks on the four personalities found in Beelzebub's Tales, lecture number 1, beginning on page 1189, we are left to decide for ourselves, and we must decide, to which of the three series those remarks belong. You should read that section in the original, but I have abbreviated part of his remarks for clarity. The whole individuality of every man must already at the beginning of his responsible life must inevitably consist of four definite, distinct personalities. He explains the arising and content of the four personalities in some detail in that section. His description of the four personalities is accurate, complete, and should be studied by all students of his writings. However, in the early to mid stages of our study, that material is a bit difficult to grasp all at once. It is seemingly abstract and leaves us with some level of confusion. Gurdjieff was aware of that, and so in order to clear up that confusion, immediately following page 1192, he wraps up everything previously said about the four personalities in the more approachable second series four-piece analogy of the hackney carriage, horse, coachman and passenger. But how does that relate to the three totalities of functioning? Let's see whether we can merge the hackney carriage analogy with what Gurdjieff says about the three totalities. You already know that the carriage is the physical centre, the horse the emotional, and the driver is our mental centre. In order to view the hackney carriage in a useful way, it will be necessary to take an omniscient point of view. That is, picture the carriage, horse and driver, minus the owner, from an aerial perspective where you are looking down at the scene from above. Then, from above, slice that scene precisely in half from the back of the carriage to the tip of the horse's nose, so that you split the scene with one half of the montage on the right, the other half on the left, as in the positive and negative or active and passive halves of our centres. You now have a fairly good representation of our first two totalities of functioning. The third totality is the absent owner of the carriage. In normal free-brain beings, the owner is truly absent, his place taken now and then by this or that chance passer-by. With these unfortunates, however, the owner is present, but is so very thin and weak as to be almost invisible, and so has no control over the driver, who cannot even hear the owner's instructions. So weak is the owner's voice, and so asleep the driver. In the situation of a weak owner, which is the situation of most of these unfortunates, the hackney driver, knowing no better, continues to pick up various passers-by as passengers. We will get back to the weak owner in detail in a more appropriate place, but here we will keep our focus on the three totalities of functioning. Since a good understanding of your three major components is essential for gaining a useful understanding of how Gurdjieff's chief exercise obtains results, as well as almost everything else covered in his third series, it would be good for you to take another look, or two or three, at the section previously mentioned in Life is Real, pages 144, 145, 149, in which you will find that Gurdjieff assiduously avoids use of the word centres. In the most significant and practical of these explanations, Gurdjieff describes the three totalities of functioning by ways of his favourite technique. By demonstration, he portrays the three totalities as the three main characters on a very large canvas. These three totalities are presented in situations showing their relations and interactions as the three main characters of Beelzebub's tales, found throughout the book from beginning to end. These totalities are shown not in righteous disarray as in usual with these unfortunates, but, with a few exceptions, are shown in their proper relationship. In violation of that relationship, he demonstrates that our usual self, the second totality of functioning, is a jealous sort and may be resentful of surrendering his leading role to follow the better leadership of Carriage. That is carried by Beelzebub's response to a remark by that totality on page 225. A few related notes on real I. As this may be useful later, I'll point out a few of our elders' remarks on real I. Hartmann relays one of Gurdjieff's teachings in Our Life when he says, "Real I cannot be made angry." By my experience, awareness of that trait can be a very good reality check. In my case, usually after the fact, but as they say, better late than never. Imagining or pretending to real I seems to be a common activity among thinkers. Even Descartes fell for it, and has become a popular parlour game in various social gatherings where it is enjoyed and reinforced by all present. At one such soirée, I sat in amazement as the man was testifying, with a self-satisfied smile, dreamy eyes and voice, and role-playing plastered all over his face, saying, "When I am in real I, yada yada yada." Self-hypnosis is so natural a thing it is almost impossible to escape falling under its spell. Group hypnosis is even more powerful. One woman, a group discussion leader of a non-foundation type group, with that same far-off glaze of the eyes and enlightened tone of voice, once told me of how some others told her that she, having overcome it, had almost no personality, the bad, left, and had become the purest of essence, the good. Obviously she confused essence, which of the first two totalities is indeed our more real self, with real I. As Patriarch Knott tells us on page 85 of Journey, such confusion is not uncommon. But essence can be spoiled and warped. Man most ignorant when he's most assured, his glassy essence plays such fantastic tricks. Having more important matters to address, real I, Carriage, does not sit around thinking about how real he is, and he does not express thoughts in words. It is personality that thinks and speaks with words. As that knowledge may be useful in eventually learning to more clearly hear Carriage's voice, we will return to that topic in more detail later. For now we continue with instruction from Gurdjieff, whose instruction is far easier to hear than Gurdjieff's. On the other hand, Gurdjieff's instruction, once we are able to hear it, is far easier to understand than Gurdjieff's. The hunt continued. As said, everyone who has read the Taos, Meetings, I Am and Herald has already run across Gurdjieff's instruction in this matter. The problem is we do not at that time realise what Gurdjieff was saying, and we did not know what he was saying for many reasons, one of which is that we are limited to and by the third kind of reason. But the primary reason is that Gurdjieff expresses his teachings by methods with which we are not yet familiar. If we can remedy that, we will be one step closer to finally reading his instructions on the chief exercise for ourselves. Two of Gurdjieff's methods of instruction are of unusual importance. One of them, in contemporary Western society, is a relatively unknown and seldom used form of allegory, and the other is somewhat like allegory, but its message is carried by a different sensory modality altogether. That second modality is visual and involves picturing. Following the lead of Frank Pinder on Patriarch Not, Teachings, page 228, we will call it picture form language. While Gurdjieff's description of this method as the creation of images without words, Meetings, page 231, was meant to arouse our interest but to no definitive conclusion. Frank Pinder's description, given later in Benign Collusion with Gurdjieff and Patriarch Not, was meant to be more frank and straightforward. The first method mentioned is called Podobnisarnian, and it is of major importance that we become well versed with that method. Now I know that you probably think you already understand allegory, and I'm sure that you do, but not necessarily Gurdjieff's allegory. He disguises his allegory as something entirely unexpected. He disguises it as literal. Still, we must learn to read his Podobnisarnian writings, which we will explore in our next chapter. As an aid in understanding our three totalities of functioning, and of equal importance for gaining some initial experience with picture form language, I will repeat and emphasize my previous suggestion that you read and thoroughly ponder a section of Herald found on pages 40-something. I will also repeat Gurdjieff's advice to study for the attainment of a higher gradation of being. And now we move on to what these days is a rather rare form of allegory, one Gurdjieff gives the name Podobnisarnian, along with, as usual, 2 or 3 alternate names. Chapter 4.